feel the energy continue in this room, especially as Barbara shared the history of where you've been. And actually, for the past 8 years, we've been in a Venus transit cycle. And so it's quite remarkable that you've been doing this all that time. And we can talk about that, but I suspect that that might have something to do with why I'm here right now, because I studied Astrosophy, which is the star knowledge that comes out of Anthroposophy. And I didn't start there. I started with calendars when I was about 9, and then was introduced to astrology as well as Anthroposophy in my 18th year. And it's been 30 years since. I'm now 48 and will celebrate my 49th birthday while Herbert is in Denmark. My birthday falls on Easter this year. If you are someone like me, then you take your subject matter and listen to it in everything that somebody says. So I'm always listening for the stars and the rhythm of the planets in what I hear. And so if I look like I've got a confused look on my face, it's because I'm calculating ages and figuring out constellations. But I share that because I was born during the vernal full moon, which is the first full moon after vernal equinox, which is used to establish the dates of the movable feasts throughout the year. I feel like that's my moon. Every year it's on a different date, and that sets up quite a mystery for you when it's your moon. And so it's been a lifelong journey of trying to understand my relationship to that. And then in 2007, Easter fell on my birthday, which meant that the vernal full moon was several days earlier, and I announced to my children, I have 4, that I was going to move my birthday from the full moon day to Easter Sunday so that it would become a movable feast. And they all said, well, Mom, that's just because you want to celebrate your birthday more often. But actually this year, and it's rare for this to happen, but in 2007, Easter fell on April 8th, and again this year it will be on April 8th. So I'm going to try again to move myself to the Easter sun as opposed to the vernal full moon. And we'll talk a little bit about the dynamic and the relationship there. And given that Herbert is in the room, I'm going to start with this little poem by Emily Dickinson. And I share this kind of by way of disclaimer, that there will be a lot of information, and you shouldn't fret if you don't remember all of it. And I'll try not to give you too much, but I can err on the side of too much information. So if it's getting overload, just say stop. But it's important to know when you're working with the planets and the stars that they have a rhythm, just as we have a rhythm in our breathing, in our sleeping, in our waking, in the beating of our hearts. And that everything has its season. And when we receive information, sometimes it goes in and it slumbers for a while to come up next week, next month, 10 years from now. And when you speak about life, when you have the planets and the stars behind you, it makes quite an impression in the listener. And I always try to be mindful of that. I also trust that if you don't remember anything that I say, and if next year Barbara is standing here saying, well, last year we had Mary Adams, but who remembers that? I'll be okay with it. I hope you don't. I'd like to make a more lasting impression. Anyway, so, Emily Dickinson. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our and firm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So it's a dawning. Let's see. I started studying, as I said, astrology when I was about 18. I was introduced to Astrosophy in my 32nd year when I encountered Hazel Straker, who was a companion and research companion with Willie Suker, who was given the task by Elizabeth Riga, who was a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner, of developing Astrosophy. And I took a whole year to read his book, Cosmic Christianity and the Changing Countenance of Cosmology, which, if you're interested in astrosophy, is a good place to start.
The name of it again?
Cosmic Christianity and the Changing Countenance of Cosmology. And in that book, he discusses toward the end the movements of the planets specifically during the 3 years that the Christ was on the earth. And it's a fascinating study of the rhythms and the patterns that are made by the planets as they move about the earth. And then the following year, Hazel Straker came through my community again. I'm from Michigan. I was living in southeast Michigan at the time and had my children in the Ann Arbor Waldorf community. And 10 years ago, I moved to northern Michigan, where there are no anthroposophists, save me and my mom. We do host a weekly book study, but the night sky is magnificent out there. And several years ago, I started an initiative to get international dark sky designation for a 600-acre county-owned park there. And that designation was announced in May of this year, making our area home to one of only 6 such parks in the United States and one of only 9 in the whole world. And the dark sky park is a place over which the night sky is protected from light pollution and light trespass. And where I live, on the shores of Lake Michigan, there are beautiful efforts there to protect the land and the water and the wildlife and now the night sky. So I feel very, very fortunate. We are stewards of that for our fellow men that can't be in places where they can witness the night sky. And because of this designation, now the state legislature in Michigan, our representative from our area has introduced legislation designating a dark sky coast on 23,000 contiguous acres up there. So it's quite an achievement. And my motive has been to safeguard the human imagination by protecting our access to the night sky and its stories. And remember that I'm in a non-anthroposophical community. So this has been quite an experience of the enthusiasm and the interest in my local community in just having the stories of the night sky. No telescopes, no research institutes, just getting out in the dark and experiencing ourselves as human beings. It makes us quite unique as a dark sky park in the international community because typically these places are designated by astronomers where they're doing research with telescopes and satellites and computers and data. And so we are very unique, and I'm asked through the International Dark Sky Association to consult internationally with dark sky places around the world about the kind of programming that I do, which is all based on the cultural understanding and the folk tales and the fairy tales and the once upon a time about the night sky. So as an anthroposophist, it's very thrilling because there's this very broad public audience that's really interested, and Michigan is poised to really promote this because we've been suffering in the economy with what's going on. So that's kind of who I am. And Tuesday I was at the state capitol in Michigan testifying, first time I ever did that, in front of a House committee on natural resources, outdoor recreation, and tourism. So, and now here I am. So it's kind of been a very interesting journey. So that's the nuts and bolts of Mary Stewart Adams. But what I would like to talk about tonight is to kind of set the stage. The title for the theme, Cosmic Cycles, Earthly Rhythms, actually came to me from Tamara Slayton, who passed away in 2003. She was a mentor of mine, and we met in 1997. So the year that Hazel Straker, when I asked her, how does one become an astrosopher, she chanted my name to me. A week later, I met Tamara Slayton and then started dreaming about Rudolf Steiner and Marie Steiner. I didn't know at the time that he was married. I didn't know any of the history of the anthroposophical movement. And all these images started flooding in, and I found my feet on the path of destiny. So, Cosmic Cycles, Earthly Rhythms was a book that Tamara intended to write, and she said, if I don't write it with you when I'm alive, we're going to do it from across the threshold. And she's still waiting. But it has, for me, to do with trying to understand how the macrocosmic rhythm works into the microcosmic rhythm of the human life. And I consider myself a student of astrosophy, trying to understand myself with the stars as companions. It is true, as Emily Dickinson said, they are like asterisks to point the way to a human life. When you have a relationship with the rhythm of the planets and the stars, you can find your way to the most significant events that are taking place in your life. It just gives signposts. So it's not necessarily a crutch, but it's a real helping hand. At least it has been in my life to understand, oh, that was when I was in this particular Saturn cycle, or this was when Mars was doing that. So what I wanted to do tonight was to first create a context for understanding where are we and the cycle of the year. And in the introduction to the original calendar of the soul, Rudolf Steiner says we can express our relationship to a particular time by speaking of the positions of the stars in this moment. So most of us, I think, went outside to take a look at Venus and Jupiter. Over here in the west, they're among the stars, or quite close to the stars of the constellation Aries. And then Mars was here in the east, kind of at the belly of the constellation Leo, the lion. Saturn will be coming up later. It's close to Spica in the constellation of Virgo. And let's see, Mercury is probably below the horizon already. It's still in the stars of Pisces and setting with the sun. So those are the classical planets. Those are the planets that are visible to the naked eye. In an ancient astrological tradition, those were the only planets. And Saturn, with the rings around it, defined the area or the territory within which that which is human can unfold. So Saturn is regarded as Father Time, and it sets the boundary. And when we look at the human life and talk about the 7-year cycles, that's based on the Saturn rhythm. It takes 28 years for Saturn to go from the place where it was at birth, around the sun, and back to that place. We divide that rhythm into 4 parts: birth to 7, which is the early childhood, 7 to 14, the older child, 14 to 21, is the adolescence, and then 21 to 28, young adulthood. And then Saturn is back at the beginning. This is referred to as the Saturn return. And then that process begins over again. And there can be a new birth that happens at that time. So it's as though one is freed from the circumstances into which you were born, and there's an opportunity to make a decision out of your individuality at that time. There are a lot of different ways that I can go from there, but I think what I'd like to do is start with where this idea comes from in me, out of the research that I do, because it's a lovely story, and it will help before I get to the image that I'm going to create. And it's that, and Rudolf Steiner says this in a lecture that's included in Elizabeth Grader's book that used to be called Astrosophy and Astrology. I'm not sure if that's still the title of it. They were letters that she wrote about star knowledge during her time as a contemporary of Rudolf Steiner. And it is that each of us comes from a particular star. This is not necessarily the stars that are in the constellation where the sun was when you were born. But of all the billions of stars out there, that one particular star is the one that each of us came from. And that as we journey toward physical incarnation on the earth, we will have experiences moving through the starry world that result in us sharing some stars, and that's how we come together with one another. But the moment of decision to take up earthly incarnation again happens when the soul is in the vicinity of its star. And this moment is referred to as the midnight of the soul. So that's not a moment of depression when we're on the earth. It's a moment of decision that's made when one is in the spiritual world. And this is some research that I've been doing. I don't know that it is so, but if you read the book of Jonah, it's quite possible that when he's describing his being swallowed by the whale and having a vision of what's to come, that this is the moment immediately following the midnight of the soul. When you look into the night sky, you see among the constellation Pisces and Cetus, the whale right below it, the Pisces-Cetus superclusters, stars just hanging out there in clusters, waiting perhaps for incarnation. To be swallowed by the whale is to come toward earthly incarnation. When you get to the Greek epic and the myth of Perseus turning the whale to stone, then you have the beginning of the end of that kind of knowledge. We no longer understand being swallowed by the whale as code for taking up earthly incarnation. So the soul makes its decision to come toward the earth and moves through the starry realms and then comes into the planetary spheres, picking up substance, some which was left behind from the former incarnation, but also weaving together that which will create the right circumstances for the life that is being pursued, all the way until the soul comes to the realm of the moon. Just as Saturn, with its rings, creates a boundary around what is inherently human in our particular planetary system. So the moon creates a boundary around the Earth. To get to the Earth, you have to come through the moon sphere. And you can't just do that anywhere. You have to come through a point referred to as the node of the moon. That's N-O-D-E. This is a crossing point between the orbital plane of the Earth and the orbital plane of the moon. They're not on the same plane. So they cross at 2 points. The southernmost point is called the south node. The northernmost point is called the north node. This is so with every planet. It has the nodal points because the planets are not all on the same plane, even though they move through the zodiac relatively close to one another. The planes of their orbits are not tilted so much, but this is also what causes the Venus transit, where it appears that Venus is moving across the sun. We'll talk about that later.